Welcome to another edition of the Mediatwits. I'm your host, Andrew Lih, professor of journalism at American University, filling in for Mark Glaser this week. So March 7th is the National Day of Unplugging, a sundown to sundown, self-imposed electronics exile inspired by the Jewish Sabbath, which begins each Friday evening and ends at nightfall on Saturday. The traditional Sabbath has been an opportunity to spend time with family and rest after a week of work. Some abstain from using electricity or driving as a symbol of absolute relaxation and reflection. So the National Day of Unplugging is, in fact, a 21st century digital Sabbath. Dr. Steiner-Adair argues in her book that technology changes the social fabric of families, providing new parenting challenges and creating a barrier in relationships. It can even become an addiction, as some internet users find themselves unable to tear themselves away from the limitlessness of cyberspace. Despite all the marvels of the digital age, are the 9 hours in front of screens every day stealing too much time away from face-to-face interaction? The Day of Unplugging was created over a decade ago before rich online human interaction became common. So today we have rich forms of human-oriented engagement too: online dating, social networking, Skype video, Google Hangouts, FaceTime, Snapchat, and other live connections to others. So are the digital Sabbath concerns the same 10 years later after its creation, or do we need to guard against new dynamics and addictions? So we're really happy to be joined this week by Monica Guzman of the Seattle Times and Geekwire, Tanya Schevitz of Reboot, the creators of the National Day of Unplugging, Hilarie Cash, the co-founder of Restart Internet Addiction Recovery Program, and if we can, Dr. Catherine Steiner-Adair, author of The Big Disconnect, Protecting Childhood and Family Relationships in the Digital Age. So I thought we could start with Tanya Schevitz of Reboot, the folks who created the National Day of Unplugging. Tell us a little bit about how this originated and how maybe it's evolved in the last 10 years. I think it was 2003 when you first proposed this.
Actually, Reboot was established in 2003. The National Day of Unplugging is 5 years old. It was established in 2010. And it came about, the National Day of Unplugging came about because we recognize that people are overwhelmed by having to respond to every ping, beep, and ring of their smartphones and their digital devices. Society has created this situation where people feel like they need to be reachable at all times and they need to reach people at all times. So this is a way to reclaim the ancient day of rest, to really give people a chance to take a pause and reconnect with the people and the community around them.
And I know that Monica has written a number of things about this in terms of how to integrate technology with your life but still kind of retain your humanity. So rather than one day a year, Monica, you've written a little bit about how you've tried to take little slices of your life to do mini Sabbaths as well.
Yeah, for months I did no-tech Sundays, and they were incredibly hard, but I would literally put my phone in a drawer, close the drawer, and that was it. Among the hardest things were just getting around. I had become so accustomed to Google Maps and things like that, just on the go. I actually had to pay attention to the streets again, which I haven't had to do in years. And I realized, actually last year I took a week and disconnected. And what the huge realization from that week was, my brain works so differently when it is not on technology. And what I mean by that is, time slowed down, my senses became more acute, and my brain seemed to be able to just look around again. And then when I reconnected to technology, it took about 2 hours of email for all the cravings that I had starved during that week to come flooding back. And that was the first day of my vacation that I was so irritated because I had no idea my brain was that vulnerable. And this has happened over years. I mean, when I started No Tech Sundays, that was 2 years ago. And I think even in the last 2 years, the intensity with which my brain is always thinking, I've got to check my email. Oh my God, I've got to check my email. I've got to check Twitter all the time. I'm going to put my food in the microwave for a minute. Well, before I put my food in the microwave, let me check Twitter. Oh, and now my food is ready in the microwave. Hey, that's another opportunity to check Twitter. Just over and over and over again. So the data I want to know, it's not how much total time we are in front of screens. I wish there was an app that would count the number of times I flick open my phone screen, because I wonder if it's in the thousands now.
I mean, it's
I'm
interesting.
sure. I'm sure it is. I just want to just add that for the National Day of Unplugging, the project absolutely isn't just focused on one day. It's an ongoing thing, and it's rooted in our larger project called the Sabbath Manifesto. But for the National Day of Unplugging, we say to people, try this once and then do it regularly. In no way is one day enough. One day a year enough. So this is really just to raise awareness for people.
It's Catherine Steiner-Adair joining in. One of the things I hear a lot from kids is when their schools invite them on an overnight retreat, they go through this cycle that's very similar to what you described. They get anxious, and they think, oh my God, do I have any friends? And then they have to constantly resist the urge to check for a device that they had to leave back at school. And by the end of the trip, they talk about how they experience themselves in their body, in their little soul, in their relationship so wonderfully, and how awful it felt to come back to life plugged in again. And they then were able to ask the question, ooh, what are we really missing? But it took days of being unplugged and kind of going through tech withdrawal.
Right. I mean, getting back to what Monica said, and for any of you, what's interesting is I think folks of a certain age can kind of compare where we are now with connectedness and electronic devices to a simpler time. But then you have folks like Claire. Maybe you're what they call digital native, even though I don't really like the digital native term. But for someone like Claire, do you have something to compare it against, or has it just always been this way? And actually, going to an unplugged state is a really new and something unfamiliar to you.
So I was born in 1993. So when I was a kid, dial-up was the internet that we used, and I got my first smartphone when I came to college, my sophomore year, so 2 years ago. So I think that I've always grown up in technology, but definitely in college that's been accelerated because I feel like having a smartphone is really when you start to never be unplugged. So when you have a smartphone, you're standing in line, you're waiting for the microwave to cook your food, and you're always checking your phone. So I think throughout my 20 years of living, it's been more and more accelerated to the point where I can't imagine unplugging ever.
So
and that's why. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, that's why for the National Day of Unplugging this year and last year, we've evolved to really asking people what they like to do if they unplug, what they would like to do, because I think that people do have this feeling like, I have no idea how to function. I have no idea what to do if I put down my phone. I'm so used to picking up my phone in those moments. I don't know how to be bored. And so if you really sit down and think, oh, you know what, I actually like to hike, and I like to play tennis, or I like to do crafts, or I like to watch the sunset drinking a glass of wine. If you think about those moments, then it helps you when you think about putting down your cell phone. So we created this I Unplug To campaign where we ask people to hold a sign, and Catherine has done it for us, where it says I unplug to, and hers is I unplug to paint, and you fill it in, and we actually do photo booths all over the place asking people to do this, but we've had just people all over the world upload their own photos. I think it's very helpful to stop and think, like, what is it that I could do when I unplug, instead of just doing it without even taking that moment, because then you do find yourself like standing in line and like, okay, I don't know what to do now with myself.
It's one of the things that our clients who come out to restart struggle with the most. When they come, they are spending 45 to 90 days away from all digital technology, but we provide them a very rich environment of activities so that they are engaging in ways that they find interesting. Sometimes they're bored, but mostly they're pretty satisfied during that period. But once they move on into the phase 2 of our program, where they're now living in apartments and they're really having to engage life as independent young adults, they really struggle with figuring out what to do with themselves. And especially those who've been sitting in front of screens since they were very young. And so the way they're wired, they just have failed to develop other hobbies and interests that they can fall back on. And so they're really having to think about, kind of for the first time, and they often feel extremely frightened and uncomfortable and anxious and not really knowing how to move out into the world and just be exploratory.
That's fascinating. I know that I've thought a lot about the end of waiting, how I feel like as long as you have a smartphone, you never have to wait. And that waiting has now become a chance to do other things. Mm-hmm. So you're waiting in the doctor's office, you're waiting for your friend to arrive at a restaurant, you're waiting in line at the bank. Your smartphone is not so much a distraction as it is, oh, my list of things to do that never ends. And so you can constantly, if you don't have a new email to check, well, you have some news site to go look at, and chances are one of your hundreds of inboxes has something new. So we never, ever have to wait. And how does that change the way we live our lives? I'm utterly fascinated by that.
I think it has some pretty serious implications in our ability to be alone with ourselves, which is so much what the National Day of Unplugging is all about. I think that what we see is people become screen dependent. I mean, this is why they go to Hilarie's wonderful program for 45 days, because you get so quickly used to marking every single transition in your life by plugging into a device, which is actually kind of like a stimulant. So we lose the ability to just be quiet in ourselves, to be patient, to be bored, quote bored, where we daydream, where we deal with anticipatory anxiety, where we sort of go through those mind states that prepare us for the next place. But most of all, we are constantly using screens to get through every waiting moment, every transition. And when parents say things like, I could never change a diaper without having an app to give my baby, we're starting to introduce babies to this way of being human, which is an inability just to connect to yourself, soothe yourself, be quiet with yourself, wander inside of yourself. It's really a big difference in how we function.
So let me be devil's advocate and say, how do we know that's a bad thing? Now, I don't agree. I mean, I think that it probably is a bad thing, but it is difficult to articulate how. When this world of screens makes us more productive, more able to work on the projects that we want to work on, more connected with people who can help us achieve what we want to achieve, and more able to work on things regardless of where we are or when it is. We can still take steps forward in all our projects. So I do want to throw that out there. Like, what if, our kids grow up and go, our grandparents used to think this was a problem. But man, they used to live boring lives. They used to have to sit there with themselves. How awful. We're so much more advanced now that we've got these screen superpowers. So what if that's the way humanity goes?
Well, I think that it really goes to a balance. I mean, absolutely, that's important. Technology has changed our lives in so many ways, and it's a technological wonder that we could be having this conversation, that we can take our smartphones or our technology with us everywhere. But it's about achieving a balance. So we're not saying at all that you shouldn't use all those technological devices to the benefit of, your work, your home life, everything. But there needs to be some sort of balance. And I think that those children who you're saying, they'll grow up and say, oh my God, can you believe my grandparents lived without this? Right now, they're saying different things. And Catherine knows this. I went in yesterday and spoke to some 8th graders, and it was just absolutely heartbreaking to hear what they said about their parents' technology use, how they're completely ignored by their parents. I have these quotes from these kids saying, I try to talk to my mom, she doesn't even look up, she doesn't acknowledge me. I talk to my dad, there's a huge silence, and I just feel alone. Another girl saying that after dinner, her stepfather goes and works in his office, her mom goes into her room and watches a movie, and she tries to go in and talk to her, and she says, I'm just trying to relax, I need some time. And she said, I just go in my room and I'm alone. And she said, I cannot remember the last time we had a real conversation. And these kids, they're feeling it. And if these 8th graders are voicing that, these are kids who have their own lives, who don't necessarily want their parents around them all the time. If they're feeling it, imagine what our younger kids are feeling, the elementary school, the preschoolers. They may not be able to articulate it, but I'm sure they're feeling the same thing. And Catherine has so much in her book about the impact of that, and it's really damaging. So I think that the balance is just so vital, that, to take those important parts of technology, but also to recognize there are moments when we should not be using it.
Claire, you want to chime in as one of the folks who probably views us as the old fuddy-duddies.
Yeah, something that I think is really important to consider when having a conversation like this is that if always being plugged in is a problem, then it's a systemic problem. Because if everyone can be plugged in all the time, then expectations are such that you are always plugged in all the time. You know, if you have a smartphone and your boss sends you an email and you don't respond within a couple of hours, that's a problem. So I think that when having conversations like this, you can't look at one person and say, well, you should unplug, because it has to be a cultural shift in order for that to be sustainable.
That's so accurate, Claire. I just will quickly say that I think one of the new conversations I'm really excited to be participating is in corporations now, where companies are saying, you know, what is fair and what's systemic and what should we be expecting of people because the pressure is so intense.
And something I was going to say is that I haven't been to South Korea, but one of the things that I find very interesting is that they have an enormous public education campaign. They've recognized it as a #1 public health problem. They've recognized internet addiction as an official disorder, and they produce softbound books, which they give all teachers, all parents, all therapists, and all students. And these books are really designed to help people develop a healthy relationship to technology. But it is, because I think the woman is it Claire who just made the point about the systemic problem that it is, and I completely agree. So I'm sure we all agree that it's a systemic problem, and it's hard for me to imagine, but I do think it's going to take an enormous grassroots movement of people who have awareness of this, creating the kind of pressure that is going to be needed in order to get official recognition of the problem and a public health campaign started and all of these kinds of things.
They also actually lead the world in effective treatment programs for 5-year-olds.
That's right.
Oh.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. I guess I'm kind of guilty of this as well. One of the classes that I teach is about Wikipedia editing, and I've kind of expected my students to watch our Facebook page for our class several times a day. Not like several times a week, several times a day. So this has got me thinking that I should probably dial this back into something more episodic rather than relying on a continuous 7-day-a-week engagement with students. Although that's part of the justification for the class is to find out what does a 24-hour, a day encyclopedia look like. But that might be adding more stress to their lives, hearing from Claire and from Hilarie on this one. I'm wondering, what do you, 5 years ago, we certainly didn't have as many of the social media, so much social media dominance as we have today. And as Monica said, maybe one of the arguments is that social media allows us to stay in touch with folks that we probably would not have stayed in touch with if it wasn't for electronic means. So does that change at all what you're thinking about, Tanya, in terms of the Sabbath, that maybe you could have Skype or FaceTime or some of these things to actually connect people using technology but still trying to stay, human-oriented at the same time?
Right. Absolutely. In fact, I had this discussion with the students yesterday that it's not, the National Day of Unplugging is not some rigid thing. It's open to individual interpretation. The National Day of Unplugging was designed to be open to individual interpretation. And the idea is that you shut down devices that are disconnecting you, or behaviors that are disconnecting you from others. So if you're using, Skype to call a grandfather or grandmother somewhere else, every Saturday or every whatever it is, that, even if it's during your unplugged time, that seems totally fine, because that's a way to connect, and it's the only way for you to connect. If they're, like my father's in Germany and we Skype with him regularly with my children. So it's really, and social media as well, you might, be connecting with, friends on social media, but it's when people get stuck in that rabbit hole of like checking Facebook and scrolling through Facebook that's really damaging. So if you can control it and get on it just to connect, to make that one connection, then that's fine, but it's not, it usually is not people are not capable of that. Usually people do fall into the rabbit hole of scrolling through and seeing what everyone else is doing and checking out what's going on and what events are happening. So I think that there's a danger, especially with the social media, but something like Skype, I wouldn't say that you have to, shut off your lights and not use your car. So it's really open to individual interpretation to things that, help you connect with others and do not keep you from connecting to others.
Right.
But I would like to make a comment, if I could, about something that I noticed recently about Skype, because my son is in England, and so we Skype every week or two, and I was thinking about how even when there's Skype, I'm not actually looking into his eyes. Mm-hmm. I am watching his face, but I'm not really looking at him. And there's this wonderful concept of limbic resonance, which is which is something that happens inside the limbic brain when two people are face to face, and they feel safe and cared about within that relationship, and that bouquet of neurochemicals that gets released and has this name of limbic resonance keeps us regulated. And I think what happens is that people are relying more and more on digital media as a way to connect, and I certainly would rather be Skyping with my son than not seeing him at all, but it's certainly, in the population I work with, it really has become the substitute for the face-to-face interactions, and those face-to-face interactions are so much more important to our well-being than Skype and other things.
Right. So, related to what Claire said before, she said she couldn't imagine her life without the smartphone and being connected. So, is Claire your next client, Hilarie, or Catherine? What do you think? Is this new generation? We have to change our expectations with this next generation?
I think we definitely will change a lot of our expectations, and we'll continue to do so going forward. Google Glasses are just around the corner. But I think there are some essential qualities about being human that are different from technology. And I think what Hilarie was talking about is the kind of intimacy that is only capable of being fully experienced when we are visually and physically and sort of in terms of ambient awareness, just fully present with somebody. And technology can't replace that. And when we turn from a talking community to a texting one, and we eliminate tone, which is sort of the new thing with this generation of tweens and teens, this is the first generation of young kids to think it's weird to talk to one another and just listen to each other and to speech. And Skyping's divine, but as Hilarie said, it doesn't give us the same kind of deep looking into the other person, to the eye is the window of the soul type of quality of connection. And the other thing is, tech is a tool, and it can be used wonderfully, and it can be used horribly. But there's one quality about being human tech cannot give us, and that is the capacity for solitude and some kind of spiritual connection, and experiencing a reflective, inner, deep connection to yourself that, as far as I know, so far at least, tech can't nurture that aspect of who we are. And I think that's a very important thing to stay in touch with, which is in part why the tech Shabbat, just the language of, some kind of spiritual or framework about how to be alone with yourself and also how to connect to something even more wondrous than the cloud. It's an important part of who we are.
Right.
I think what they're saying about Skype is so important, because in what I'm saying is that it should only be when absolutely there's no other way to connect. Social media, for instance, like now that I'm thinking about your question, I have some friends. I have a friend whose husband was sick, and I saw her at some point, and she's like, "Well, I asked her something, and she's like, "Well, didn't you see it on Facebook?" And I was kind of shocked. Like, I was expected to follow everything that was going on Facebook, and they live here, and we connect, occasionally. And so when Claire or Monica, I'm sorry, Claire, when Claire was saying this is a way to connect, I think that if there's any other option, that should not be the way to connect. Absolutely. Like, I do not want to connect with people over Facebook. in terms of keeping up my actual relationship with them. You know, if I could find a friend from college or high school through Facebook or Twitter and then connect with them, that's great, but that's not how I want to maintain my relationship, and that's definitely not what we would encourage people. We would definitely say that people should shut that down during, you know, during their break from technology.
Right.
Well, I kind of, sorry.
Go ahead, Tanya.
I see Facebook and Twitter as gossip mills, you know, where it's just people talking about their interpersonal relationships and each other and their personal lives all the time, and it's just this constant stream. So I think that it, you know, gives you this the same quality and value that gossip gives you, where people consume it like what you were saying earlier, this rabbit hole where you can spend hours just scrolling through Facebook. But it can be a great way to connect with people, just like gossip is. You know what's going on in another person's life. But at the end of the day, it's just as valuable.
Claire, I have a question for you. Do you think there's been any shift in your generation's capacity to fall in love and have in college really deep, you know, serious, intimate relationships?
Do I think that there's been a shift in terms of how people...
Yeah, their capacity to fall in love, form vulnerable, open, deep relationships. I've heard people say tech has helped it. I've heard people say tech has actually distanced people. What would you say?
Gosh, well, I've only ever known the sort of falling in love that happens in 10 to 2013. But I think that technology definitely plays a role in a way that it might not have earlier, where you have conversations over email and conversations over text, where, you know, maybe you'll go on a date and then you expect to receive a text, you know, just that following day or even that night, instead of, I don't know, waiting 3 days to call someone. You know, it's definitely much more sped up, I think, because you can send a text. But I don't know.
Things have certainly changed from our era when online dating was the final act of desperation, whereas with Claire's generation, it is just commonplace. It's why wouldn't you, right? And that's what's so interesting.
But I would like to also add in a comment here, which is that I see a great many young men who are actually not interested in dating at all, because they are, on the one hand, they never have dated, and their sexual template has been formed around pornography, which separates sexuality and relationships. So I actually feel concerned about people of your generation, Claire, because I worry that a lot of young men are actually not very available to date, because, or if they do want to date, they don't have many good skills around dating because they haven't been practicing. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
I don't think that's fair. I'm no pornography expert, but I think that it's been around for ages, and maybe it's available in a different medium now. But you know, there have always been ways for young men to access sexual fantasies and things like that, and the internet is just one more tool for that. I don't think that changes the landscape.
I hope you're right. I know that the men that I work with in general fall into this pattern that I'm talking about, of often having not dated at all, and you know, they're in their 20s and they're kind of terrified of dating. But I do have a very particular population that I work with, so I'm glad to hear that that's not what you think is going on more generally.
I think one thing that definitely has changed, and it's impacting kids in different ways, and I think, Hilarie, you work with people who've been really seriously impacted by this, but it is something we have to be mindful of, and that's the fact that beginning of about age 12 today, kids are getting their sex ed online, and it is a very different education. The course content is quite different from what one used to see in the Playboy magazine. So I was at first surprised, and then I kind of got used to it when I interviewed so many kids, especially middle schoolers, 12, 13-year-old boys who would ask me questions like, excuse me, Dr. Steiner-Adair, but can you just explain to me why a woman would want to be choked having sex? And I said, well, that's a really good question. You know, where does that come from? And they say, oh, well, it's stuff we see on YouTube and porn on the internet. And, you know, and it's very clear that they are forming impressions about what sexual intimacy is, as well as sometimes adapting their sexual response cycle to it, which gets kids into some kind of trouble sometimes. So I think what the internet has done is it's taken away certain boundaries that used to protect kids' exposure to certain aspects of the adult world in all its good or yay or whatever judgment you have about it. But kids can access kinds of information that unprecedented ways that previously they couldn't, and it does impact their worldview.
I'm fairly convinced Claire is not your typical case. She's smarter than your average person of her age. But I do worry about that too, that the internet gives ready access to very rich, very concentrated, uncontextualized media that really does change the way that you interact with the real world. And I kind of call it the high fructose corn syrup of media, being able to click on random YouTube videos, look at Facebook feeds, and have so much come into your consciousness so quickly, uncontextualized. And that's something that is fascinating to study. So I'm so happy to have you folks here. We have some of the experts in the world on this issue on our podcast, and I really thank you folks for joining us today. And we'll have many podcasts in the future talking about this issue, I'm sure. So thanks again to Catherine, to Hilarie, and to Claire, who we kind of put under the spotlight, but I'm really happy you engaged with some really interesting views from the millennial generation. And thanks again for watching the PBS Media Shift podcast. We'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.